Hi, this is Mike Campbell, founder of Glossika. In this video, I'm going to run down the conjugations of several languages to kind of give you a top-down view of how conjugations work across languages. Now, conjugations have simplified in English quite a bit over the years, so that now we don't really have any conjugations left in English. So it's often a challenge for English speakers to learn the conjugations of other languages because you don't really have a base to jump from. The other thing is that conjugations don't exist in all languages. In some languages of East Asia, for example, the tonal languages, or also the Austronesian languages of the Pacific Islands and Philippines and Indonesia, they don't normally use a whole lot of conjugation. Instead, they're aspect-focused languages. So aspect focus means that they focus on the continuing or finishing of a verb rather than the actual person who is doing the action. Instead, that is kind of understood by context in the sentence. So mostly what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be focusing on the Middle Eastern and European languages in this video, where conjugation happens the most in most of the languages that we tend to learn. So the first thing is that what we'll notice about English, if we run through the conjugations for just the present and the past, and we're only going to have time to cover these in the video, but what we do is we normally run through 6 conjugations by person and by number. So we just do it in order. So I, you, he, she, it, and then we, you, they, and you is a singular and plural. So in English we have a 0, 0, and then an S ending. So for example, do, does, and then 0, 0, 0 ending. So do, do. So for example, I do, you do, he does, and then we do, you do, and they do. The first language we'll take a look at is Latin. With each of the endings, what I want you to notice are the actual consonants used, because these consonants are kind of a universal thing across many of the languages. So the first thing is that what we have is an o, as, at, amus, atis, ant. So I'm using an a ending here, but that a can sometimes be an e ending. So you might have o, s, et, emus, emus, etis, ent. So if I just drop off the vowels, we ignore the vowels because they have several different conjugation forms in each language. We just focus on those consonant endings. You have o, s, et, mus, dis, ent. Okay, so that's Latin. And the first person in Latin can sometimes have an M ending. This is important to notice because some languages are going to tend towards the M and some languages are going to tend towards the vowel, the O ending. So if we look at Italian and Spanish, they're quite similar. So Italian is O, I, A. So they've actually dropped off the S and T endings and now it's just left with vowels. So O, I, A, and then amo, ate, and anno. Now the thing is with the anno is that there's an extra syllable added on the end of the word and the T has disappeared over time. So this extra syllable does not change the stress in the word. So your stress is always going to be 2 syllables back before the end of the word for the anno endings. So if I say parlo, parlamo, parlate, and then parlano. So your stress is still in the same position. And Italian is kind of special in that case where it's added an extra syllable at the end of that word. So with the past tense in Italian, basically you're only going to be using the past participle. And the past participle is really easy to make because you have just a to ending for most of them. And you combine it with an avere or essere verb. So you're either going to have a have or a be verb in front of a past participle with a to ending. Now remember that this past participle with the to, that T, is very important here because this T is going to show up again and again across the languages we look at. So if we look at the Spanish, for example, if we take the verb poder or puedo, puedes, puede, podemos, podéis, and poden. So what you have here is you have the os and then a 0 ending and then mos, is, and en for most of the verbs. Now the imperfect tense for the past progressive in Spanish, you're either adding a B into the ending or you can do some other endings with the vowel endings. And the future is kind of interesting across French, Spanish, and Italian because you normally just kind of go with the infinitive ending in R and then you add in the conjugation on top of that. So the future is pretty easy to remember that with that. So if let's jump across the language family a little bit and go over to Persian. Persian, a lot of people think that it's related to Arabic, but it's not. It's actually related to Latin and Slavic languages and the languages of India. So Persian, with the endings in the present tense, you have am, id, and then im, id, and. And so at the end of that, it sounds almost like the Latin where you have ant. And then Persian, actually this and, they don't normally pronounce the D at the end of the word. So it's really am-i-id, im-id, an. So that's really interesting. And when you look at the past tense in Persian, it's almost the same thing. They're just, you know, the T and the D are actually very similar and closely pronounced in the mouth. D is the voiced version of T. And in Persian, they're not using T, they're just using D instead in the past tense. So it's dam, and then they add the conjugation on top of that. So dam di, and then d, and then dim di dand. So it's really easy to follow this conjugation. It's very similar to the Latin and the Italian conjugation there. Again, the first person using M in both the singular and plural, and then the plural has a D for the U, but just a vowel in the singular. And the third person, it still has a D, like the Latin T, and also a D in the third person plural, just like the Latin T. So the Latin T becomes an id, and the Latin int becomes an and in Persian. So they're very, very similar in their structure. So if we look at German, German has basically taken that Latin S ending and it's become an ST ending. But other than that, most of them are the same. The thing about German is that there are no M endings on the ends of words. So they've simplified it and they've become maybe softer. They become N's instead. So the thing is, where you have an M ending in Latin, it's become an N ending in German. And then German also does not have the compound NT ending. It's just drop the T at the end. So what you get here is a German first person is changed a little bit. It becomes an E ending, which is pronounced like a schwa. For example, I give, ich gebe, so it's an ending. And then so running through the 6 people, you have st, t, and then t, un. So these follow very closely to the Latin, just a little bit of a simplification there. The past tense in German is pretty straightforward. You're just using the T at the end of the verb. Now German, the actual usage of German is a little bit different. You can't just run into go straight into using the past tense directly, and we'll save that for a different video. But just looking at the structure of the verbs, that's pretty straightforward. Now the Russian and Polish of Eastern Europe, the thing with this is that we started with Latin, saying you have an O ending. In Russian, that becomes an U ending. So O becomes U. This is similar in a lot of languages like Portuguese, where you have O at the end of a word becoming an U pronunciation. The S and T endings in Latin for second and third person becomes a sh and a t. So only the sh changes. So Latin O S T becomes Russian U sh t. And then in Russian, the plurals are M, T, and at. M, T, and at, whereas in Latin, they were amos, atis, and ant. So what we notice here is that the third person plural, at, sometimes can be an ut, depending on the kind of verb it is. Now the past tense in Russian and most Slavic languages are very straightforward. All of your past tenses end with an L. So that originally what was a T has now become an L. Now it's also in the same position in the mouth. It's just become softer. And it's actually softened even more in Polish. That L becomes a back L. It sounds like a W. So it's o. So in Russian, I can say to have done, delal. You have to conjugate it for feminine, so delala, delalo, and delali for the kind of person, whether it's masculine, feminine, or plural. And then in Polish, it's the same thing, but it's become even softer. It's become a back L. So it becomes an o. Also, you have to add the ending. So if they're a, o, and I for the plural and the feminine and whatnot. But in Polish, what you have is you still have the M ending, like the Latin M for the first person. And just like the Russian, you have a sh ending, and then you have a 0 ending for the third person. And then you have m, ch, and yon. So m has the M ending, and then ch, it was originally a T that has softened into a soft T or a palatalized T, so it's ch. And then the third person plural, yon. Now that yon has a nasalized sound in it. So it's an A with a hook. And with that hook, it makes the vowel nasalized. Nasalization has moved onto the vowel itself in Polish. So originally it was an N in Latin, and it has now become a nasalized vowel. So it's still a small remnant of that N. So Polish has a lot of words where the nasalization comes from a really old spelling. Maybe you can find a relative in Latin words with an N. Okay, so if we look at across all of the Slavic languages, basically they're following almost exact same pattern. One of the major differences is in the South Slavic languages like Serbian and Croatian, what you're going to have in the past tense is that L is softening even more and becoming an O ending. And so it's really, really easy to recognize what those past tenses are. Now, the Bulgarian actually is also the same, but Bulgarian is in its own little subgroup of the South Slavic languages, and so in the past tense, all of those L's become an X. In the Cyrillic script, that's actually a ch sound. So you're going to have ch, she, she, and chmech, te, cha in the across those 6 conjugations in the past tense. So what's interesting in Bulgarian, you have to conjugate each one of those past tenses. Okay, so if we look at Latvian and Lithuanian, the only other 2 left of the major groups of Europe, what we have here are, in the present tense you have ui and then 0, am, at, ad. That's pretty straightforward. The past tense inserts a y between those endings and a little bit of lengthening on the vowel. And then in Lithuanian you have ui 0 and then mete 0. So it's actually funny because the word met and te kind of means me and you in a lot of languages. So that's actually their plural endings on the verbs in Lithuanian. Now, if we jump away from the European languages, we're going to see that same pattern actually showing up again, especially with the past tense. You either have a T or a D. So if we look at Georgian, Georgian is kind of an interesting language. It's its own little isolated language family out there from the country of Georgia. But what you have instead of a m, that m has become a v sound, and then they put it at the beginning of the word. So the I in the we form is now a V that appears at the beginning of the verb. So it's a different language family, so it's different grammar, but you still have a very similar kind of sounds appearing in the conjugations. So you have that V there. And then, so across the conjugations in the present tense, you have V, 0 for you, and then an S for he, and you have a V and a T. So they use the T for the plurals, okay? So V, T, and then just a T on the U, and then an N ending for the they. Now that N ending in the they is almost the same as all the other European languages, so that's great. And then in the imperfective, the past tense, you basically have the exact same conjugation, but with a D inserted at in the ending. So it's just like having that past tense T or D that appears in all the other languages. So that D, Georgia is very close to Persia, to Iran, right? So they're using the Ds, the same as the Persian languages. So you have V, D, and then D, da, dit, dit, and dnen. Okay, then we get to Arabic. Now Arabic is interesting because it's also using prefixes and suffixes just like Georgian is. So if you look at the Arabic, I also see that in the plural, they're also using a lot of the N's like the German does, which were simplified over time from an M. So in Arabic, we have a'u, and then ta'u, ya'u, and then na'u, ta'una, and then ya'una. So what I notice here is that the U form is using a T, which is easy to remember in a lot of European languages because T or tu can refer to you. And then the he form just uses a Y prefix. So that's a little bit easier to remember as well. And then the past tense for Arabic is tu, ta, a, na, tum, u. Again, you have that letter T appearing in most of the conjugation of the past tense. So that's great. We're finding a really big pattern here with using these M's and N's and T's across the conjugations of languages. In Hungarian, those 6 conjugations in the present are ok, s, 0, and then unk, tok, nak. What I notice about Hungarian is that you have a lot of K's being used. But in the U, in the plural, you have the T, tok, and then you also have N's appearing in both the we and the they form, unk and nak. And that matches the Arabic, and that matches the N in Georgian, and it also matches German and many of the other European languages, having that N in the plural form. Okay, so next one is with Turkish, you have in, sin, 0, and then is, sinis, ler. And then in the past tense, you have dim, din, di, dik, dinis, diler. And so what's interesting here is that you have the D in the past tense, just like the Georgian and the Persian. And I forgot to mention the past tense of Hungarian. So you have tam, tom, tal, t, and then tunk, tok, tok. So you also have that T in the past tense of Hungarian. So if you look at the big picture of conjugations across languages, if you've noticed what I've seen, is that you tend to have a big breakdown of almost zero endings in the third person for he, she, it in many languages, like Spanish, Latvian, Lithuanian, and Hungarian and Turkish. And the first person will often have a vowel or an M ending, and then the third person plural, the they, the we and they forms in most languages will have either an M for we and an N for they, or they'll simplify into both N's in both cases. So there's a little bit of specific things happening in each language that may differ from language to language, but there's an overall pattern across all languages where if I'm going to go pick up a new language that I've never learned before, for example, I've never learned Hungarian or Turkish, but looking at those verb conjugations real quick, I can insert them in my mind and I can actually recall which ones they belong to really quick because I have a few little anchors in my mind of how I can match each one. So that makes it really, really easy to pick up verb conjugations in more languages. So what I tend to do is I tend to focus less on trying to remember the individual conjugations because I've kind of got that down, but I try to focus more on like how do they use this past tense? You know, how do they do the verb combinations and more complex combinations in the language? Because that's where it really gets tricky among languages. So a lot of these languages are not going to be using the imperfect or the past tense directly. They're going to be using a combination of different things. And so that's where it really tests your understanding and ability to pick up that language. So I would say getting these basics down and having a pattern of trying to acquire the conjugations as quickly as possible is going to take you really, really far, much farther, much faster, so that now you can focus on actual usage and how to use each combination of verb tense in those languages. And I hope that helped you get a big picture of conjugations across many of the world's languages, and look forward to seeing you in the next video.